Boldwood presents A Sister's Destiny, written by Rosie Clarke and read by Julie Maisie. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. She was lost in the enveloping mist, alone and yet not alone, for they were with her. She could see their faces, thousands of faces, disembodied and reproachful, looming out at her from the dense fog. So many dead men marching through the mist, thousands upon thousands, lost in the cruelest of wars, their eyes reproaching her. "Forgive us, we could not save you," she cried, tossing on her pillow as the dream deepened. "Our tears could not save you." There were more faces in the mist, dearer and closer to her heart. One face, apart from the others, separate and more terrible in its reproach, because his death was her fault. Part 1. Chapter 1. "I'm glad to see you're well wrapped up today. It's bitter cold and I shall be glad to get home to a fire." Standing shivering in the cold that bitter January day in 1914, Jane Shaw turned her head as she heard her neighbour's voice. She was standing outside Woolworths in the main street of March in Cambridgeshire, the small railway town where she had lived for the whole of her 18 years, wondering whether she could afford to buy a penny bar of chocolate for her young brother. "Have you been to work this morning, Aggie? I thought you were working nights at the pub." "My boss asked me if I would go in this morning." Aggie Bristow, a comfortable-looking, middle-aged woman with brown hair and twinkling grey eyes, bent over the shabby pram Jane had parked on the pavement. "How's young Charlie, then?" "He isn't at all well." Jane looked anxiously at her brother. "He hasn't got over the chill he had at Christmas. He isn't as strong as other children of his age." "If it hadn't been for the care you lavish on him, lass, I think the poor lad would have been gone before now. You're better to him than most mothers, though it ain't fair you have to stay home and look after the boy." "I don't mind taking care of him." Jane smiled as her brother waved his gloved fist at her. People thought there was something very wrong with him. The doctor had told Jane that it might be something to do with him having been born to a mother in her middle years, whose health was poor, but Jane thought he was just slow at learning. Charlie was sometimes difficult to control, but he had a lovely nature. "I was just wondering if I should buy him a bar of chocolate. I promised Melia she could have some new pencils for school, but Charlie deserves a treat because he's so poorly." Aggie put her hand into her coat pocket and pulled out a threepenny piece. "Here, take this, Jane. The lad deserves—" "Good gracious me! Look at that horse!" Jane glanced in the direction Aggie had pointed out and gasped. A horse was careering down the high street of the small market town, its reins hanging loose. Even as she was wondering what had happened to the rider, she saw that a young boy, playing with a wooden hoop, was standing right in its path. "Look after Charlie!" Jane yelled at her neighbour, and rushed out into the road in front of a cyclist, who had stopped in confusion to avoid the horse, and a parked van, whose driver was in one of the shops. She caught the boy by the arm and dragged him clear, pushing him towards the path just as the horse brushed past them both, knocking her forward so that she landed on her knees in the road. Winded and shocked, Jane remained on her knees for a few moments after the horse had raced on down the road. She was vaguely aware of shouting and screaming, the sound of a car braking hastily, a hooter blasting, and then a man wearing riding breeches running after the maddened horse and yelling at the top of his voice. The boy she had saved was crying noisily and being comforted by a large woman in a smart brown coat with an astrakhan collar. "Are you all right, miss?" A man in a grey overcoat and trilby hat came up to Jane as she struggled to her feet. "You might have been killed." "I was afraid the boy would be knocked over." Jane winced as she looked down at her coat and saw the muddy stains. Her knees felt sore where she had fallen, though she didn't think she had any other injuries. "I'm not badly hurt. I was lucky." "It's a miracle no one was killed." The van driver had been examining the side of his vehicle and now came to join the little crowd around Jane. "Horses are damned dangerous beasts if they aren't kept under control." The sound of shouting and cheering made them all turn round and look. A man in working clothes had launched himself at the horse and grabbed the reins as the beast crashed into a stall selling vegetables at the side of the road. Potatoes, cabbages, and other goods had spilled out into the road, and several vehicles had halted suddenly, causing confusion and noise. But the horse was now finally restored to its rider. "Thank goodness someone stopped it before it did more damage," Aggie said as Jane joined her in front of Woolworths. "That was a foolish thing to do, love. What would have happened to young Charlie if you'd been killed?" Jane was shaking. "I was afraid the boy would be trampled. It didn't occur to me that I might be hurt." "You want to get straight home, love." The woman in the brown coat came up to Jane and touched her hand. "You saved my Tom's life. I reckon you deserve a medal." "It was just instinct." Jane blushed as she became aware of people looking at her curiously. She caught sight of her reflection in a shop window. Her dark hair was tucked under a red felt cloche hat, and her skin had a greyish tinge, her eyes slightly dazed. "Yes, I should get home, Maggie. I'll walk with you if you don't mind." "Course I don't mind." Aggie took hold of the pram handle. "I'll look after Charlie. You can pop into the corner shop and get him a bar of chocolate on the way home. What you need now is a cup of hot sweet tea, my girl." "Where have you been?" Jane's mother was in the kitchen when she wheeled the pram into the big room and lifted Charlie out, sitting him on the shabby but comfortable sofa. "I wanted a drink and you weren't here. I had to come down and make it myself." "I'm sorry I was out when you needed me. I had a cup of tea with Aggie." "I thought I told you I didn't want you going round there." Helen Shaw's sharp eyes went over her. "What happened to your coat? It looks as if you'd been rolling in the mud." "I fell over. Aggie was there and she saw I was a bit shaken, so she insisted on making me a cup of tea." Jane wouldn't dream of telling her mother that she had pulled a young lad clear of a charging horse. No sympathy would be given. She would simply be lectured for reckless behaviour. "I'm sorry I was so long. I popped back to the corner shop and got Charlie some chocolate." "Why you want to waste money on him, I don't know. He doesn't appreciate it." Jane held back the retort that sprang to her lips. Arguing with her mother was a waste of time and might bring on one of Helen Shaw's bad heads. "He loves chocolate, Mum. You know he does." Charlie was small for his age, unable to walk properly, though he was 3 years old. "What he loves is neither here nor there. I don't think it is good for him to be indulged." Jane sighed as she put some water in a saucepan and set it on the range. Charlie might eat a soft-boiled egg if he felt well enough. She had baked earlier that morning, and he enjoyed bread and butter cut into soldiers. "I'm going to fetch the Coke in now," Jane said and picked up the bucket. As she moved it, a stack of fairly recent newspapers used for lighting the fire fell over. She picked one up, glancing at the headline about a scheduled aeroplane making a flight from St. Petersburg to Tampa, and marvelled at the idea of such a modern miracle. "Well, get on with it," Mrs. Shaw said. "I'm not very hungry, but you can make me some cheese on toast. You can bring it to me in bed." "Will you watch Charlie while I fetch the Coke?" "For goodness sake, am I expected to do everything? Be quick then. I have a headache coming on." Jane heard the church clock striking 12. She had been up most of the night with Charlie because he had been crying and miserable all day. He hadn't seemed too bad the day they'd gone shopping in the high street, and he had eaten the chocolate bar she'd bought with Aggie's threepence. However, his cold seemed to get worse that night, and he seemed really ill when she got him up the following morning. Jane had asked her mother twice if they should have the doctor, but Mrs. Shaw thought it a waste of money. Outside the cottage, the rain was lashing down, beating against the small window panes. The wind made an eerie sound as it howled about the eaves, drowning the sound of a train pulling into the marshalling yards across the embankment. Yet the noise of the wind was nothing compared to the sound of Charlie screaming. "Hush, Charlie, sweetheart," she begged as she bent over his cot and stroked his head. His skin felt hot and dry. He had been crying for hours, and nothing she did would stop his pitiful wailing. "Please don't cry, my love. You'll wake Ma and she needs her sleep." Charlie stared at her without comprehension. Although Charlie should have been by now, he still wasn't walking at all, though he managed to speak a few words when desperate for attention. "What's wrong with him, love?" Jane's father entered the small bedroom. She turned her head to look at him. He was dressed in a pair of old cord trousers held up by black braces and a grey shirt. "He hasn't been well all day, Pa." John Shaw walked to the cot and bent over to look at the child. He lifted Charlie under his arms and held him up to look at his red face, then pressed the thin body to his shoulder, patting the child's back as he began to walk up and down the small room. The child's wails waned to a mewling cry, tears trickling down his cheeks. "You get off to bed, Jane. You've been up half the night with him." "You look tired to death yourself." Jane watched him, noticing how gentle and loving he was to the little boy. "You worked too hard, all those long hours at the office." Her father was a clerk to a solicitor in the small but thriving town of March. They were situated a few miles from the cathedral city in the Isle of Ely, which could be reached by bus or train. A longer train journey would take them into the city of Cambridge, with its ancient colleges and green parks. But Jane had visited the city no more than a few times in her life. Her father worked hard for them, but his wages were sufficient only to keep them respectable. She was 18, and ought by rights to have been at work for the past 3 years. But Jane's mother insisted she stay at home to look after her and her sister and brother. Helen Shaw clung to her bed most of the time, and though she was able to come down and even go out if she felt inclined, she seldom did. "It isn't fair on you, Pa. I should be able to work to help with the bills." "Now then, Janey, love," he said, and smiled at her with faint reproof. "You know your mother can't cope with Charlie. If it were just your sister Melia and us, she might let you go to work. But this little fella needs too much attention." Charlie let out a wail of misery. His father put a hand to his forehead and frowned. "He is burning up. His skin was dry, but now it feels clammy. I think I had best fetch the doctor in case he is really ill." "Thank you. I should have fetched him earlier." "Don't blame yourself." They both knew whose fault it was, but neither of them would say a word to the culprit. Helen Shaw suffered terrible headaches, and her family lived in fear of distressing her. "The weather is atrocious tonight. Wrap up well, Pa. We don't want you catching cold." "Don't worry, Jane. I'll be as quick as I can. Just do your best to keep Charlie from waking your ma." Jane hushed her brother, putting him back in the cots, but he started to scream immediately, and she had to pick him up once more. "Hush, my darling." She rocked him gently in her arms. "Yes, I know you feel bad. Your poor little tummy aches, doesn't it?" There was the sound of hurried steps down the stairs, and then the door closing sharply. "Rock-a-bye baby in the treetops." Jane was singing softly to her brother, and did not hear the shuffle of slippers on linoleum. "Can't you keep that brat quiet? How am I supposed to sleep with that racket going on all night? Oh, I can feel one of my headaches coming on. Leave him alone to cry and fetch me a hot drink." "If I put Charlie down, he will scream again. I'll take him with me while I make your drink, Ma. Perhaps a little hot milk would help Charlie too." "That's right, put that little monster first." Jane swallowed her protest. Mrs. Shaw felt herself hard done by no matter how much they all tried to make her life easier. Jane was tied to the house most of the time, though she went shopping when she had the chance. Her only free time came when her younger sister Melia was home from school to run errands for their mother. She carried Charlie pressed close to her shoulder and went down to the kitchen. His tears soaked into her nightgown, his whimpering cries a relief from the terrible screaming. The kitchen range was still warm, but the fire needed making up to heat the milk. Jane settled her brother on the sofa, placing soft cushions all round him to keep him from rolling off. Charlie continued to sniffle when she left him, but his screams had stopped for the moment. It was warmer in the kitchen than in his own room, which might be why he seemed easier now. Jane wondered if the damp, cold atmosphere of the bedrooms was part of his troubles, the reason he was so often ill. The cottage was old and undoubtedly needed repairs, but the landlord said there was nothing he could do. Jane's father had done what he could to improve things himself. It was her father who had run a pipe into the house from the standpipe in the yard, so that they at least had a deep stone sink with running water. That saved Jane the trouble of going out to the yard every time she needed to fill the kettle. The kitchen was decently furnished, with a large stripped pine dresser, a big table and enough chairs to seat all the family together, but the old sofa had seen better days. Jane wished they had an inside toilet, instead of having to walk down the yard to the outhouse where a primitive wooden-seated lavatory had been installed just before the railway sold the cottages. It actually had a cistern and chain, which was better than some people had, and something Jane was truly grateful for. As long as she kept it clean with disinfectant, it didn't smell too awful. Carrying the bedroom slops out in the morning was something she hated, but it was a chore that had to be done. She hovered near the black range, appreciating its heat. As soon as the milk was warm enough, Jane divided it between 2 mugs, giving Charlie a third of what she was taking for her mother. She topped her brother's milk up with a little cold water so that it would not be too hot for him. "Stay there, darling," she told him, pushing the mug into both his hands. He could feed himself, though he often refused to eat unless she put each spoonful into his mouth. "Hold the mug tight, darling. Drink your milk. I'll be back in a minute." "No, Jane, stay," Charlie wailed, and tipped the milk over his chest. He screamed as it touched his skin, though Jane knew it wasn't hot enough to hurt him. She put the tray for her mother on the large scrubbed pine table and fetched a towel, mopping up the liquid Charlie had spilled. "Jane, not go." "I have to take this for Ma," Jane said. "Sit there and don't move until I get back." Charlie set up a wail of protest as she picked up the tray and went out, but she decided to leave him to cry for a while. She couldn't possibly carry him and the hot milk. Perhaps her mother was right. Perhaps she did spoil him, but it broke her heart to see him in distress. He wasn't like other children. He couldn't do much for himself, and sometimes, when he tried to walk, his body seemed to just flop over. The doctor had told her he would never improve. "You have to face it, Jane. Charlie has learning difficulties. I know he seems to understand, and you think he's just a bit slower than others, but the chances are that he will get worse, not better." Jane resented the doctor's plain speaking. She prayed every night that her brother's condition would improve. "You took your time," Helen Shaw grumbled as Jane carried her drink into the bedroom. She sipped the milk and pulled a face. "It's almost cold." "I'm sorry. Charlie spilled some of his, and I can heat it again if you want." "I'll drink it as it is." A loud scream came from downstairs. "Oh, see what is wrong with that brat now." Jane needed no urging from her mother. She rushed down to the kitchen, discovering that her brother had fallen from the sofa and crawled to the range. He must have tried to get into the bucket of Coke and tipped the contents over himself. "Charlie!" Jane carried him back to the sofa. Pulling the nightgown over his head to change him, she planted a kiss on his hot little body. Usually he giggled when she did something like that, but he was too distressed. All better now. Carrying Charlie, Jane went to the window and looked out. The rain was still sheeting down. Her father would be soaked to the skin. "Your daddy will be back soon," she promised, as Charlie started to sob again. Poor little boy. She paced up and down the kitchen, occasionally glancing out of the window. The wavering light of a carriage lamp made her sigh with relief. Thank goodness! Her father was with the doctor in the gig, and he jumped down, leading the way into the kitchen. "I saw the light," John Shaw said. "Is he worse?" "He woke Ma. I came down to fetch her a hot drink." "I see." He reached for a towel from the airing line above the range and began to rub vigorously at his dark hair. "Let the doctor look at him, Jane." Jane placed her brother amongst the cushions on the old sofa, standing back to watch anxiously as the doctor began his examination. "How long has he been like this, Jane?" Dr. Martin gave her a concerned look. "The fever started yesterday. He was miserable when I got him up first thing, but he only started to scream an hour or so after I put him to bed this evening." "Why didn't you send for me earlier in the day?" "I thought it was just a tummy ache. Is he really ill?" "I think he should be in hospital." Dr. Martin glanced at her father. "Are you prepared for the expense? Charlie has a putrid fever. If he stays in this damp cottage, I think this chill could turn to pneumonia. Of course, in the circumstances, you might feel the expense is too much." "What do you mean in the circumstances? Charlie is worth it, isn't he, Pa?" Her eyes appealed to her father. "I'll go to work. Anything to help Charlie." "I'll manage somehow, Jane. My son has to have his chance, Doctor. I'll find the money to pay, but I will need time." "I can arrange for you to have time to pay at the cottage hospital. They owe me a few favours." Dr. Martin looked at Jane. "Can you wrap him up warm, please? You had better get dressed yourself. I shall need you to come with me." The next few hours were long and anxious ones for Jane. Her brother was taken into the doctor's care after what seemed a desperate dash to the local cottage hospital, and she was asked to wait in a cold little room that had only a small window high up. The walls were painted in glossy dark green to halfway up, and then a dull cream. She paced up and down as the minutes ticked by at a snail's pace, feeling helpless. What were they doing to her brother, and why had no one come to tell her what was going on? Jane had no means of telling the time, but she could hear a clock striking sometimes, and when it struck 8 times, she decided to go in search of someone. Seeing a nurse in a long, dark grey skirt and white apron, she called to her. "Yes, miss? What are you doing here? Visiting times are not until this afternoon between 3 and 5. "We brought my brother in as an emergency last night. I was told to wait, but no one came to let me know how he was getting on." The nurse frowned. "It isn't usual for family to wait. You should have been told to go home and come back this afternoon. I suggest you do that now, miss." "Jane Shaw. My brother's name is Charlie. Please, could you find out where he is and how he is? Charlie isn't like other children, and he will be upset without me to look after him." The nurse hesitated, then her expression softened. "He will be in the children's ward. Stay here and I will inquire for you." Jane thanked her, watching anxiously as she went off. She was gone for a while, but at least there was a window here that Jane could look out of, and she contented herself with gazing at some damp rose bushes and water dripping from the trees. "Did you think I'd forgotten you? Did you find out anything? Is Charlie—" She stopped, suddenly fearing the worst. He was sleeping peacefully. Sister said he had a bad hour or so, but the doctors gave him something for his chest infection, and she thinks the crisis may have passed. You can visit him this afternoon." "Couldn't I see him now?" "Sister is getting ready for matron's rounds. I've told you he is being well cared for. Please go home now and come again this afternoon." It was all a fuss about nothing. When Jane entered her mother's bedroom, she was sitting up in bed, reading a copy of Ethel M. Dell's book, The Way of the Eagle. Jane had paid 2d at the library to get it for her mother, because there was a long waiting list. I told you he didn't need the doctor, and he certainly didn't need to go to hospital. What is that going to cost? Besides, it would be a relief for all of us if that nuisance—" Seeing the angry look in her daughter's eyes, she hesitated. "I know you care about Charlie, but he takes up too much of your attention." "Don't call Charlie names, Ma." "You should face the truth, Jane. He is mentally and physically impaired. One of these days, we're going to have to put him away in an institution. It would be better to let him die when he is ill." "I'm going to do some washing while Charlie is away." Jane turned away. "Call me if you need something." If she had stayed another moment, she would have accused her mother of being lazy. Jane suspected that her mother was perfectly capable of doing work in the house, at least of making a cup of tea for herself and cooking dinner. She didn't doubt that her mother's headaches were terrible at times, but she had used them as an excuse to become an invalid herself. Melia, her teenage sister, was sitting at the kitchen table, eating a slice of toast and strawberry jam. "Ma is in a terrible mood. She told me I had to stay home today in case you didn't get back to look after her. I'm here now, so you can get off to school." "It's too late." "You can tell your teacher that your brother was ill and he had to get Ma's breakfast. He will understand." "Mr. Hastings is wonderful." Melia's face lit up as she began to gather her school things. "He says that I'm bright enough to go to college and be a teacher." "That would be wonderful for you, Melia. I would have liked to do something like that, but—" She trailed off. "All the more reason for you to get off now. You don't want to get behind with your lessons." "It's rotten luck for you," Melia said, suddenly moved to hug her sister. "I feel mean sometimes, knowing that you had to give up your plans to stay home and look after Charlie." "I love Charlie. I care about you too, Melia. I want you to make something of your life." "But what about you? Won't you want to have a life of your own? Get married one day? You're really pretty, Jane. At least you would be if you ever had time to do your hair and wear a decent dress." "Thanks for the compliment." Jane glanced in the spotted mirror above the sofa and grimaced as she saw what Melia meant. "Don't worry, love. I know you meant well. Get off now and tell Mr. Hastings that I would like to talk to him about your future." "Why? You know Ma thinks I should leave school when I'm 14 this summer, so that I can look after her and you can go to work." "If it doesn't cost too much to go to college, perhaps Pa would persuade her that you should stay on at school." Melia's face lit up. "Do you mean it, Janie? Would you do that for me? I thought you would jump at the chance of going to work." "I don't have the chance to be a teacher. The best I shall do is work in a shop." Jane sighed inwardly. "Besides, Charlie isn't happy with anyone but me. It makes sense that you should have your chance, Melia." "I'll ask Mr. Hastings to come and see you one evening. You will like him, Jane." Melia hesitated, then, "I heard something about you from Tom Brown's mother. She says you pushed him out of the way of a bolting horse the other day. You didn't tell me, Jane." "Because it was nothing. I just pushed him out of the way." "Mr. Hastings says it was an act of heroism." "And he will be cross if you're late for class. So hurry and get ready. I've got a lot of work to do." "I've been worried about Charlie all day," Jane's father said when he came into the kitchen that evening. "How is he, Jane?" Jane looked at him in silence, then, "The nurses told me that he was recovering well when I visited this afternoon, but he was asleep all the time I was there. I think they have given him something to keep him quiet." "For his own good, I expect. I suppose they think it is better to sedate him for a while, just until he's over his illness." "Yes, perhaps." Jane hesitated. She'd got the impression that the nurses on duty seemed to think that her brother was less important than other patients because he was different or slower than his peers. "Charlie's life is worth something, Pa. You know how loving he is when he is well." "You worry about him too much." He put his arm about her shoulders. "When he was born, I was warned that he might not have a long life." "I know, but he should be allowed to enjoy what he has, shouldn't he?" "Yes, of course he should." John Shaw turned away, lifting the lid on a saucepan. "The stew smells good, Janey." He broke off and sneezed, his shoulders shaking. "I hope you haven't taken a chill. You were soaked through last night." "I'll be all right." He arched his brows as Jane hovered. "What is it? Something is on your mind." "It's about Melia. Ma says she should leave school in the summer when she is 14 and take my place so that I can go to work." "It is only fair she should take her turn. I thought you wanted a job." "If Ma could look after Charlie, I would jump at it, but Melia may have a chance to go to college and learn to be a teacher." "Wouldn't that cost a lot of money?" "There might be some sort of scholarship. I think it is free if you pass the exams and win an assisted place." "That would mean we would have to go on managing on my wage. I was counting on you to bring in something when Melia left school." "It would be a good life for her, Pa." "Yes." He drove his fingers through his dark hair. "Let me think about it, Janey. I might find a way of earning extra." "You already work too hard. Perhaps we should forget it. But Melia isn't very good with Charlie." "I'll see what I can do. Don't say anything to her for the moment." "Miss Shaw?" Jane stared at the young man standing at her front door a couple of days later. She had been in the middle of making a fruitcake when the bell rang. "Your sister asked me to call. You wanted to talk about her chances of becoming a teacher." "You were Mr. Hastings." He must be Melia's teacher, she thought. He was young and very good-looking, with his dark blonde hair and inquiring blue eyes. She put her hand up to her own dark locks, feeling conscious that she had dragged her hair back into a knot to keep it out of her eyes. "Please, come in. I wasn't expecting anyone. I've been cleaning and now I'm baking." "If it isn't convenient, I could come back." "Please, come in now you are here. Melia is out and my mother is asleep." She led the way into the kitchen, pleased that it wasn't full of wet washing for once. "Do you mind talking here? The front parlour fire hasn't been lit and it's cold there." "The kitchen is fine for me." Robert Hastings glanced round the big, comfortable kitchen. "I understand that you care for your mother and small brother." "Yes, I do. Charlie is in hospital at the moment. The doctor thought he might have pneumonia." She hesitated, then, "I know you think Melia is bright enough to train as a teacher, but I'm not sure it will be possible." "That is a pity. Melia seemed to think there was a chance." "I hoped there might be. I'm afraid I gave her the impression that it might be possible, but my father seems to think we couldn't afford to let her go to college." "She has the chance to win a scholarship. If she gets it, and I think she has every chance, her tuition would be free." "Yes, I thought it might be." Jane looked wistful as he arched his brows. "I once hoped to go to college myself, but it wasn't possible." "You had to leave school to look after your mother and brother?" "Yes, but that isn't important. I would like to give Melia the chance, Mr. Hastings, but my father is expecting me to bring in some money once Melia leaves school and takes my place." "It would be the waste of a bright girl's life, don't you agree?" "Yes, I do, but my father works hard for us, but he doesn't earn much, and my mother needs expensive medicine. Charlie's hospital fees will be difficult enough to find." "Yes, I see." Robert's tone expressed sympathy. "I do understand how hard it is, Miss Shaw. I had to work to put myself through college. Melia is lucky to have this chance. If she doesn't take it, I shall have to offer it to another girl." "Can you give me a few days? My father said he would see what he could do." 1 week is as long as I can delay it. I have been asked to put forward the names of girls wishing to stay on and take further education. If I call next Saturday morning, would that give you enough time?" "I'll ask my father when he comes home. If he says we can manage, I'll let you know next week." "Very well. I shall delay making my report for 1 week." He smiled at her. I think Melia is lucky to have a sister like you, Miss Shaw. We all think you were very brave to pull that young lad out of the way of the horse the other day." "The man who stopped the horse was the brave one. I could never have done that." "You wouldn't have had the strength, but your action was equally courageous." He smiled at her in approval. "Well, I can see you are busy, so I shan't delay you any longer." "Oh." It wasn't often that Jane had a chance to speak to a young man, especially one as attractive as Robert Hastings, and she felt a pang of regret. "I should have offered you a cup of tea." "Perhaps next week. I hope your brother is better soon. Good morning, Miss Shaw." "Thank you. Goodbye, Mr. Hastings." Jane did not get a chance to speak to her father that afternoon. He returned home feeling ill, sneezing and coughing. He had brought a miniature bottle of whiskey, to which he asked Jane to add hot water and sugar in a cup. He took it with him to the tiny room where he slept alone these days because of his wife's bad headaches. Jane peeped in on him later to ask if he needed anything, but he merely moaned and asked to be left alone. Jane's mother came out of her bedroom as she walked away. "What is wrong with him? I suppose he took a chill the other night." "I'm sure he will be better by Monday. I'm off to the hospital in a few minutes, Ma. Can I get anything for you before I go?" "Your sister can bring me a hot drink at 3:00. "Melia went to the church bazaar. I made some buns for her to take for the cake stall this morning." "You are always wasting money. Wait until you're earning a wage before you start giving what little we have away." "Everyone takes something. Even Aggie Bristow sends a cake for the church bazaar." "What that common tart does is her business." Helen drew her top lip back. "We all know where she earns her money. How many times do I have to tell you to have nothing to do with her, Jane?" "Aggie isn't a tart, and it isn't fair to call her names." Jane's mother slapped her face. "Don't forget, I am your mother, and I won't put up with being spoken to in that manner." Jane stared at her, putting a hand to her cheek. Her mother nagged her every day of her life, but it was the first time she had hit her. She turned and ran downstairs. If she didn't get out of the house, she would scream. "The doctors would like to do some ability tests on Charlie," Sister Norris told Jane that afternoon when she visited the hospital. "We know he isn't developing as he should, but with the proper treatment he might learn to do more for himself. I have tried to teach him to feed himself, and sometimes he can toddle about the kitchen on his own, but then he seems to lose control and just flops over." "What happens then?" "He just lies there and screams until I pick him up." Sister Norris nodded. "He has learned that screaming gets him his own way. You may think you are doing the right thing by giving him attention, but in the end it is causing him harm." "I can't bear to see him distressed." Jane felt uneasy. "How much would it cost to do the tests? I'm not sure we could afford for Charlie to stay in hospital for several weeks." "This would involve him going to a special home where they have time to look after the boy. He would live there, though you might be able to take him home now and then for a few days." "You're talking about a mental institution. No, Charlie isn't going anywhere like that." "It really would be the best for him. If your family isn't able to pay, there are state-funded places, though they are not as good as the private home we were thinking of." "You've been drugging him, haven't you? He looked at me when I spoke to him earlier and he didn't know me." "It was necessary. The child is uncontrollable." "You shouldn't have done that." Jane was so angry that she barely knew how to control her rage. "My brother may be slow, but he has a lovely nature when he is well. He was frightened in this place without me." "I've told you it isn't good for him to be picked up all the time. What are you doing?" Sister Norris glared at her as she scooped Charlie up in her arms and wrapped him in the shawl she'd brought with her. "You cannot take the boy without the doctor signing him off." "My brother is better off at home with me. I should never have let Dr. Martin send him here." Charlie's body was flopping all over the place. He obviously had no control over his limbs. "I can't believe what you've done to him. He's never been as bad as this." The nurse looked offended, angry. "Your brother has been properly cared for. He was ill when he came in and would probably have died without treatment. He would be better off dying at home than living the way you seem to think right. Jane's dark eyes narrowed in contempt. My father will pay the bill, but I'm taking Charlie home. The hospital will not be responsible if you take him now. Charlie will be better with me. How dare they treat Charlie as if he was stupid? Didn't they understand that he had feelings? She would fight tooth and nail to keep her brother from going to a mental institution. I told you it was a waste of money to send that child to the hospital. Helen Shaw watched Jane nursing her brother on the old sofa in the kitchen once they had returned from the hospital. You won't agree, but the nurse was right. How can you stand there and say that about your own son? What kind of a mother are you? They were giving Charlie drugs to keep him quiet. Look at him. Look at his eyes. He has never been like this, Ma. You know he hasn't. At least he isn't screaming. Your father is ill, Jane, really ill. I heard him coughing and went in to look at him. He may need the doctor, but I don't see how we can afford it now. I'll put Charlie in his cot, then I'll go up and see if Pa wants the doctor. She went upstairs and settled Charlie in his cot, tucking the blankets round him. He wasn't stupid. He knew when he was with people who loved him. It just took him longer to do things. He closed his eyes and she left him, hurrying to her father's room along the landing. John Shaw was tossing restlessly in the narrow bed with iron rails at the head. He had pushed the candlewick cover back, his face and neck red and flushed. "Are you very ill, Pa?" Jane asked and stroked his forehead. "Do you want me to fetch the doctor?" "I ache all over," her father said. "I don't want the doctor. Just go to the shop and ask for something for a cold. Aspirin will help." "Are you sure you don't want the doctor?" "I just need something to ease the aching. Did I hear you talking to Charlie?" "I brought him home from the hospital. They were drugging him to keep him quiet, and the nurse said the doctors thought he should be in a special home." "I couldn't afford to pay, Jane." "Sister said there was a state home, but you know what that means. Those places are awful, Pa." "We shan't let him go there. He's better off with you, Janey." Her father coughed and moaned, moving restlessly. "Try and rest, Pa. I'll fetch you something from the shop." "That's a good girl. If you could make me a hot drink when you get back, please." "Jane!" Hearing her sister call, Jane turned and waited as she left the corner shop after purchasing a strip of tablets for her father. Melia came running up to her. Her expression was petulant, resentful. "Why did you tell me I could stay on at school and go to college if you knew I couldn't?" "I thought it might be all right. I'm sorry, Melia. I suppose Mr. Hastings told you what I said." "You promised me. I told my friends I was going and now I can't." "It isn't certain yet. Pa is going to think about it, but he can't for the moment because he's ill." "I don't want to leave school and take your place. I don't mind looking after Ma sometimes, but I won't look after Charlie. He messes himself and he smells." "Stop it. Stop that this minute. I'm sick of people finding fault with Charlie. He can't help it if he can't control himself sometimes. He is slower than others, Melia. I can't deny that, and I won't apologise for it. His condition isn't his fault, and he can be lovely when he is well. You know he can." "I know." Melia wiped a tear from her cheek, a look of shame in her eyes. "I just don't want to spend my life looking after him and Ma." "It's Ma's place to look after him, but she says she can't. One of us has to do it, Melia. I don't mind staying home, but Pa may not be able to manage. He needs someone else to work and bring in money." "Mr. Hastings says I could go as a pupil teacher in another year or so. I would get a small wage. I wouldn't be qualified and I would have to go to college later, but it would be something." "I'll talk to Pa when he is better. Please don't cry, Melia, and don't blame Charlie. It isn't his fault." "Sorry." Melia looked ashamed of herself. "I didn't mean to say that about Charlie." "Even if you can't go to college, you don't have to take my place. In a few months you could find a job and I'll carry on as usual." Jane smiled at her sister as they went into the house together. "Go up and see if Ma wants anything and then take a look at Charlie. I'm going to make a hot drink for Pa." "All right. Even if I have to leave school and go to work, I'll still be luckier than you." Jane took her coat off and went into the kitchen. Filling the kettle at the sink, she put it on the range. She was about to take the tray upstairs when she heard a cry from above her. Then Melia's feet sounded on the stairs as she came running down. "It's Charlie," she gasped. "I went into Ma, as you said, then took a look at Charlie. He turned over on his stomach the way he does sometimes, and his face is blue." "Charlie!" Jane left the tray, rushing up the stairs to her brother's room. She turned him over, looking at him anxiously. He had a strange bluish colour about his lips, and his eyes had rolled upwards. She stroked his face, tears trickling down her cheeks. "Oh, Charlie! Charlie!" Melia had come into the room behind her. Jane turned to her, her face streaked with tears. She could scarcely speak, let alone think calmly. She should never have left him, even to go to the corner shop. But he had smiled at her, and she had thought he would be fine once the drugs wore off. But now he was dead. He must have suffocated with his face in the pillows. "I should never have left him," she whispered. "I should have been with him." "It isn't your fault, Jane. Charlie was ill. It could have happened at any time." "No, it is my fault. I brought him home, and I knew something was wrong. I should have been with him." She would never forgive herself. Never. "You couldn't be with him all the time. You've got Ma and Pa to think of, too." Chapter 2. "You must not blame yourself, Jane," Dr. Martin told her after he had made his examination. "Charlie was weakened by his illness. Somehow he turned over and suffocated himself." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You won't think so now, my dear, but perhaps it was for the best." Jane shook her head vehemently. "Please don't say that. I loved Charlie. He was never too much trouble for me." His death was a pain in her chest that she knew would never quite leave her. "He might have become impossible to control. You would not have wanted to see him restrained in a mental institution, would you?" Jane shook her head. "While he was a small child, you were stronger, but as he grew, his strength would have outstripped yours." "I shouldn't have left him alone." Tears burned behind her eyes and spilled over. "Charlie's death was an accident. You must comfort yourself as best you can. In time, you will know I was right. While I am here, I'll take a look at your father." "Thank you. I wanted to call you earlier, but you said an aspirin would do." "Very likely it will, but I should like to make certain." After he left the room, Jane bent over her brother's body, stroking his face. Tears trickled down her cheeks. Poor, poor little boy. "He isn't suffering any more," Melia said from the doorway. "Don't cry, Jane. Charlie was lucky to have you. Ma would have had him put away years ago if you hadn't looked after him. You loved him, even if no one else cared much." "Ma hasn't even been to look at him. She said her head aches too much." Jane blew her nose, fighting her grief. "At least you can stay on at school now, Melia. I'm going to find myself a job." "I had to pop round and ask if there was anything I could do," Aggie said when she came to the house that afternoon. "I'm real sorry for your loss, Jane. I know you loved that boy." She deposited a brown earthenware casserole on the kitchen table. "It's a bit of chicken and some vegetables. If there is anything I can do for you, lass, you have only to say." Jane held her tears back. Aggie hadn't been the only one of their close neighbours to pop round and offer food or sympathy, and she was grateful for their kindness. "My father is going to make the arrangements for the funeral, so I think we shall manage. But the casserole will save me going shopping, and I didn't feel like it today." "I should think not either. You have a bit of a rest, lass." I've got some ironing to do later. My father needs a clean shirt for the funeral tomorrow. His best suit will need steaming and pressing too. Well, if you feel better doing something. Aggie looked at her with sympathy. I'm next door if you need me, Jane. Will you stop for a cup of tea? Aggie glanced up at the ceiling. Is your mother in bed? She knows people are visiting and won't come down. Well, just a quick one then. Aggie picked up the newspaper from the kitchen table. There's a picture of the memorial to the old Queen in front of Buckingham Palace. She was a lovely lady, our Vicky, though dreadfully sad after her husband died. King Eddie is a bit of a ladies' man, so they say. Yes, he is. I'm not sure what Queen Victoria would have thought if she had seen some of the stories in the papers. Who were you talking to just now? Jane's mother demanded as she took her in a cup of tea later. I wish people would keep their noses out of our business. People are kind. They want to help, Jane replied. I've been glad of some company. Well, just remember I am trying to sleep. Helen Shaw glared at her. I've used the pot, so you'd better empty it. Jane was tempted to tell her mother to get up and empty it herself, but she held her temper. I'll fetch the slop bucket. Well, don't be long. I may go to sleep and I don't want to be disturbed. Jane sighed as she went downstairs. Why was it that everyone else could be generous and sympathetic and all her mother did was grumble? She lifted her head, refusing to feel sorry for herself as she went into the scullery to fetch the slop bucket. There was a large wicker basket of ironing on the table, waiting for her. She might as well make a start now as later. She saw that one of Charlie's nightgowns was on top. Bending down, she took it out and cradled it to her cheek, imagining she could smell him and thinking of the last time she had pulled it over his head. The tears started to trickle down her cheeks, but she brushed them away. Her heart ached, but she had to get on. There was too much to do. As soon as she had emptied the slops, she would get on with her work, and perhaps then some of the pain would ease. The rain had fallen steadily all night, but it stopped soon after dawn. Jane saw the light strengthen. She had been standing by the window for ages. It was the day of the funeral, and in a few hours Charlie would leave his home for the last time. It was breaking her heart to think of his tiny body in the cheap coffin. Ever since she'd brought Charlie back from the hospital, the anger had been growing inside her. Maybe things would have been different if her father hadn't had to work so many hours. Perhaps her mother would have been more loving to Charlie if she hadn't suffered terrible headaches. She pulled on a shabby dressing gown and went down to the kitchen. At least it was warm here, because her father had banked up the range to keep it going overnight. She was filling the kettle when she heard something behind her and turned to see her father. He was already wearing trousers and a shirt, his braces black because of the occasion. You couldn't sleep either? I've been awake hours. I thought I would make a hot drink, but you beat me to it, Janie. I keep thinking. Jane sighed. Her father was through the worst of his chill, but the phlegm had settled on his chest. I'm going to look for a job, Pa. It will make things easier for you. What about your mother? Melia can help in the house. She'll get tea when she comes home after school, and Ma can manage the rest. She always could, but she didn't see why she should when I was here to do it. That's harsh, Janie. Harsh but true. I didn't mind being here all day while I had Charlie, but now I'm going to work, and Melia is staying at school so that she can train as a teacher. Her father's weary grey eyes settled on her. You sound like your ma. God forbid, Jane said, and watched his face darken. I'm sorry. I know you don't like to hear a word said against Ma, but she is selfish, and you know it. I loved her once. She was a good wife and mother before these headaches started. Perhaps she was, but I can't forgive her for ignoring Charlie. She could have kept an eye on him while I was out running errands for everyone else. Stop blaming your ma and yourself. Charlie is gone. You can't bring him back. I'm sorry, Pa. I don't want to hurt you, but I've made up my mind.